walk into a dealership for the first time because you want to go off-road. Now, one of the questions that might pop up in your head right away is, well, which one is better for me, a side-by-side or an ATV? Now, the question of which one is better, there's no definitive answer to that, but certainly each one of these machines has its advantages and disadvantages, and we're going to walk through them all right now. Talking about utility and specifically about storage, and in this area the side-by-side really runs away with it. Now, first of all, side-by-sides almost all have beds on them, and a lot of the utility machines have dump beds like this Ranger does. Now, this is really convenient for transporting firewood or rocks or sand or anything that you just want to dump out of there on your property. With the ATV, you're going to have to get a trailer to perform that same job, and that's just one more piece of equipment to purchase and to maintain. Now, if you're looking at hand storage, that win also goes to the side-by-side. Now, side-by-sides are just bigger and wider. They have more space to store more stuff. So this Ranger specifically has all kinds of cubbies in the dash and a double glove box. It also has spots under the seats. Storage on ATVs is getting better though. Case in point, our 2016 Yamaha Kodiak has a really great storage bin right between the driver's legs, which just gives you an at-hand spot to conveniently stash your stuff. Next up, towing, and the side-by-side takes the win in this category as well. Now, in our comparison right here, this Ranger is good for 2,500 pounds, while our Yamaha Kodiak is good to tow 1,322 pounds. Now, not only will side-by-sides outpull ATVs in terms of that number, the other important thing to remember is that thanks to the longer and wider wheelbase, a side-by-side will just be more stable and competent to tow with than an ATV will. ATV manufacturers have been listening to people who tow though, because a lot of them, Yamaha included, have added a full 2-inch hitch receiver. Being able to have the same receiver for your truck and your toys makes things way easier. So when it comes to payload, you probably already guessed it, the side-by-side can definitely take more. And not only can it take more, it's just much easier to load that weight into a side-by-side because you have so much more space for it. Now here in our Ranger, we're good for 1,500 pounds of payload. When you're looking at an ATV though, the main place for your payload is on the racks. There's always a rack in the front and the rear. Now here on our Kodiak, the front rack is rated for 110 pounds. The back rack is good for 198. So total, you're good for 308 pounds of payload. But you know what, on an ATV, it's just a little trickier. You need to strap it onto the rack somehow, or you need to get some kind of accessory that attaches onto your rack. Having a bed back there, you can just throw things in loose, but the Polaris also has D-rings in the bed so you can tie stuff down there too. Hauling heavy payload is definitely more convenient in a side-by-side. The next thing you're going to want to consider is the size. Now this might seem obvious, but ATVs are smaller than side-by-sides, and that gives them a number of advantages. Now first of all, let's talk about the actual dimensions. So this Yamaha Kodiak, as it sits, is 81.5 inches long, 46.5 inches wide, and it comes up to a total height of 48.8 inches. Now when you look at this Polaris Ranger, we're talking about an overall length of 120 inches, a width of 62.5 inches, and an overall height of 77 inches, which is nearly double that of this ATV. We'll get to the advantages of being a small ATV in just a second, but first let's talk about why it's good to be big. Now I already touched on a bunch of them. You can tow more, and haul heavier stuff with a side-by-side, but the other big advantage to this size is passenger capacity. Now this Ranger can seat 3 people on its bench, but you can also get side-by-sides with 2 rows that seat either 6 people or 4 people. And not only can you carry more people than an ATV, you can carry them in much more comfort. You can get a 2-up ATV, but you're still sitting one in front of the other. You're still straddling that seat. You're just never going to get the passenger comfort out of this machine that you will out of this machine. And if that's a major purchasing consideration for you, you know, if you want to take your family all in one machine and hit the trail, well then you don't have a choice. You have to pick up a side-by-side. Not everything is positive when you're big though. So one of the big things I always notice is look at the height difference between the side-by-side and the ATV. Now that's gonna come into play, first of all, when you're out on the trail and you have, you know, low overhanging trees and stuff, but that's also gonna be important for storage. A lot of people have enclosed trailers and some of them you just won't be able to fit this machine in. Same goes for, you know, garages or different storage spaces. Something that you have now that fits your ATV comfortably might not be enough for a side-by-side. So you always need to keep the size of these things in mind, and especially the height. I feel like it's always easy to forget about how tall this thing is, but with this cage, and these are solid steel bars, it's quite tall. The other two size specs here are, of course, width and length, and they really come into play depending on the types of trails you're riding. If you're in the desert down in Nevada, yeah, you're probably fine with your machine being nice and wide. But if you're somewhere like where I am here in southern Ontario, we have thick forest, so some of the trails can be really tight. In fact, I have a perfect trail to show you the differences here.
Mother Nature always comes back to take over. These are our ATV trails, but we haven't been back here to cut them in a while. And yeah, they're pretty grown in, but it actually demonstrates exactly why the small ATV can really be a benefit.
So here's the situation where size makes a big difference. Now, this trail is barely wide enough for this 62-inch Ranger anyway, but there's a fallen tree down over the trail. So I gotta go around the tree and then find my way back to the trail. Now in this big wide side-by-side, that's kind of tricky. You gotta make sure you look up to check your height, and you're always looking around. It's also much harder for me to see my corners here. On an ATV, I can see all four wheels from the seated position. Now, the big thing here is width, but also length. Right there, I just hooked one of those stumps with my back wheel as I turned around it, and if I had a shorter machine, that would have been no problem. So there's one last really tight squeeze here between these trees, and this thing just makes it through. Just barely. So yeah, the size of a side-by-side needs to be a consideration. Oh, there's my rear right getting hooked on a rock. Because in these tight trails, this thing feels massive. So you can see, maneuvering around this tree, so much easier. I'm so much skinnier, don't have to worry about the width. The ATV turns nice and tight. And maybe most importantly, I can see all four of my corners. I can see all my wheels. I can see the whole machine around me for tight spots. There's no competition. ATV is so much better. Now, you can get 50-inch wide side-by-sides these days. There's a 50-inch Razor, there's the Can-Am Maverick Trail, but even those machines have longer wheelbases. So with tight corners, you end up getting hung up on trees, and they still have the height. So, you know, the roll cage is still up there, and if you have low overhanging things, you're still gonna hit them. So when it comes to, you know, being in tight, maneuverable spaces, it has to be the ATV. Oh, I just remembered one thing that hit me. No, literally hit me. It was a branch, and that's something to be weary of. On an ATV, there's very little occupant protection. You can get a windshield, and that's about it. If you go through deep mud, you're getting covered in mud. Deep water that's coming up over your boots and pant legs, you're getting wet. Now, in a side-by-side, a basic one, the protection isn't a lot better. The mesh doors do an okay job, and, you know, the open roll cage keeps some stuff out of your face. But here's what's important. On a side-by-side, you can get full plastic doors, a full roof, a full windshield. You can be totally shielded from the elements. And what's even better than that, you can even get HVAC these days, so you can get air conditioning and heating in your side-by-side. I don't think air conditioning is coming to ATVs anytime soon. Next up is pricing, and this one might seem obvious again, but if you want to save money, you're better off getting an ATV. Now for our units here, this Ranger XP1000, which is about the top of the Ranger lineup, starts at about $15,000 US. Now over here, our 2016 Yamaha Kodiak 700 starts at just a hair under $7,000. So the cheapest brand new ATVs available today are just under $5,000, and the cheapest brand new side-by-sides available are just under $10,000, and that holds true whether you're in the US or up here in Canada. Now let's talk about the differences in the ride of these two machines. And the first one is just the driver's seating position. So here in the side-by-side, it's exactly like what you've experienced in any car or truck you've ever driven. You have a steering wheel, a brake pedal, and a throttle pedal. And I have heard a lot of people say they like side-by-sides because of that, because they're very familiar. If you drive every day, you already understand how all of this works. And from an overall comfort standpoint, I'm just more comfortable in the side-by-side. I have a nice padded seat, and most importantly, I have a backrest, something you don't get as the driver of an ATV. I should also mention safety. Now here in the side-by-side, I do have a full roll cage, and I have a seat belt. Two things you don't get on the ATV. If you hit something on the ATV, you're on your own. You have nothing to protect you. Now, on the downside of side-by-sides, I will say there's a rollover risk here. And the entire reason why these nets and doors exist on side-by-sides is because so many people were rolling them. And when that happens, your natural reaction is to stick your hand out or stick your foot out, and people were snapping wrists and ankles. So while I do think overall the side-by-side is safer, there's definitely more of a rollover risk with this type of vehicle. When it comes to riding the ATV, it's much more akin to a motorcycle. You throw your leg over the seat and you straddle it like this, and then you have a set of handlebars for turning. Now, a lot of the controls here are much more about my hands as well. The throttle is a thumb control. The brakes are up here for my fingers. One is for the front and one is for the rear. The seating position differences here are also really what make the riding differences between a side-by-side and an ATV. So in a side-by-side, you're seated and you're stationary, and the movement of that vehicle is all dependent on, the steering wheel and the foot pedals. On an ATV, it's a much more engaged thing. So I always like to say that you drive a side-by-side, but you ride an ATV. And that's because here on an ATV, my body weight is so much more important. I can stand up, I can shift my weight wherever it needs to be. On a tight corner, I can really plant these inside wheels, or going up a steep hill, I can lean forward. And essentially what I'm doing is changing the center of gravity on this machine. So when you're really hustling through a corner, it's a much more engaging ride on an ATV. A side-by-side essentially does all the work for you. On an ATV, you feel like you and the machine are doing the work, and that's a fulfilling thing. The other big thing is I can use my legs as suspension. So as you're coming up and over rocks or hills, potholes, whatever, your legs are actually eating up a lot of what's going on underneath you.
Now I'll show you what I mean by using your legs as suspension on this big divot right here. There's a big rock there, and there's a pretty big hole right here in the trail. So you'll see me come around the corner and hit it, and on the ATV, I can use my legs to actually absorb the bump, but you'll see on the side-by-side, the suspension has to do all the work, and my body ends up absorbing a lot of that blow. Watch this.
So which one of these two is more fun? Well, of course this will change person by person, and side-by-sides are a blast. The Razor Turbo or the Maverick X3, these high-performance machines these days are crazy powerful, huge suspension travel, and I would have a ton of fun with any of them. But overall, if I had to choose which one is more fun, I have to go with an ATV, and that's because of what I mentioned. You're so much more engaged in this ride, and you feel like you're more one with the machine, and because of that, the ride here just ends up being more fun. Hopefully this video helped to clear up some of the big differences between ATVs and side-by-sides. But here's my biggest piece of advice. Make a list. Write down all of the different things you're gonna wanna do with your machine on a regular basis, and that should help inform your decision as to whether one of these big beasts or one of these little guys is gonna be better for your uses. As always, guys, make sure you hit subscribe and come back here to TFL Off-Road for the latest news, views, and real-world reviews. See ya!